It was past midnight when Jonathan Myers, the CEO of Myers Enterprises, leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, staring at the cold blue glow of his computer screen. The soft hum of the office's fluorescent lights was the only sound in the otherwise empty building. In the world of business, Jonathan was a legend. He had built his company from the ground up, turning it into a multi-billion-dollar empire. His name was known worldwide, and his every decision was scrutinized by investors, competitors, and the media. To say that Jonathan had sacrificed his life for his career would be an understatement. For the past decade, his life had revolved around meetings, deals, and never-ending work. But despite his success, there was always a nagging emptiness in him, a sense that something was missing. And that something had been, for years, his family. At this very moment, his wife, Elaine, was at home, alone. She had been pregnant for 8 months, and while Jonathan had been aware of it, he had never fully grasped the weight of what it meant to be a father. He had promised her that after this one final deal, he would be more present, that he would spend more time at home, that things would change. But every time, there was another meeting, another conference call, another investor to meet with. His promises to her had become as empty as his heart felt at times, and he knew it. He had pushed her aside for his work, and in doing so, he had distanced himself from the family he claimed to love. His phone buzzed suddenly, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Elaine, a simple message that read, "The baby is coming." A wave of panic surged through Jonathan. He had known the due date was approaching, but he hadn't expected it to happen tonight. He was in the middle of finalizing a major merger with a rival company, and the deal was critical to Myers Enterprises. His team had worked tirelessly on it for months, and if he didn't make this final pitch in the morning, it could all fall apart. He glanced at the clock, 1:30 a.m. His mind raced. Should he go home? Should he stay and finish this deal? The thought of walking away from the most important deal of his career gnawed at him, but the thought of missing the birth of his child, something that he knew he could never get back, filled him with dread. Jonathan ran his fingers through his hair, a nervous tic he'd had since childhood. He didn't want to disappoint Elaine, but the deal was critical. If he could just finish a few more calls, wrap up the details, he could head to the hospital and be there for her. But deep down, he knew that this was his moment to change. This was the moment he would have to choose between his career and his family. His entire life had been a series of choices that led him to this very moment. And as he reached for the phone, prepared to call his assistant to reschedule a meeting, a sudden call interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Myers?" The voice on the other end of the line was calm but urgent. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. It was a voice he recognized, Dr. Henry, the family doctor. "Dr. Henry," Jonathan said, his voice suddenly tight. "Is everything okay? Is Elaine?" "She's in labor," the doctor replied, his tone slightly strained. "There are complications. We need you here as soon as possible." Jonathan's mind went blank. The world outside his office seemed to blur as the words settled in. Complications. His breath caught in his chest. Complications, he repeated, feeling the weight of the word press on him. "What do you mean? Is she all right?" "She's stable for now, but we need you here. I'm afraid the baby's coming too soon. You need to be here." Jonathan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His mind was spinning as he thought about the next few moments. He couldn't fathom the idea of missing this. Yet, as he glanced at his computer screen, the blinking cursor mocking him, he also couldn't let go of the deal that was slipping away. He had always been a man of decisions, quick and decisive. But this time, he felt paralyzed. This wasn't a business decision. This wasn't a deal that could be resolved with a few smart moves. This was his family. His child. The birth of his son or daughter, something he could never get back. "Jonathan, Dr. Henry's voice broke through his thoughts. "You need to come now." Jonathan's chest tightened as his eyes darted around the room. His entire world, the sleek glass walls, the polished mahogany desk, the stacks of paperwork that represented his life's work, seemed suddenly trivial. What was all this for if not for moments like this? His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in years, Jonathan felt something close to fear, a fear of losing something that could never be replaced. He had to make a choice. With a quick, almost robotic motion, he grabbed his jacket, his mind still reeling as he rushed out the door of his office, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't even bother telling anyone he was leaving, he simply got into the elevator, the walls closing around him as the descent to the ground floor felt far too slow. His mind raced with the consequences of his decision. He knew the merger could fall apart without him. He knew there would be fallout if he didn't show up tomorrow. But what was the price of success if it meant losing everything else? The car ride to the hospital felt like an eternity. He barely registered the passing lights of the city, the sounds of the streets outside. All that mattered was Elaine and the baby. He had let them down too many times already. His mind flashed back to their last argument, the one where she told him he was never there for her, that she felt like a widow, even though he was still alive. The guilt that had built up over the years was now a tangible weight in his chest. As the car pulled up to the hospital, Jonathan's heart rate accelerated. He could see the emergency entrance in the distance, the lights of the hospital casting an eerie glow. He practically jumped out of the car before it even came to a full stop, rushing through the doors and down the sterile, white hallway. The smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils as he approached the delivery room. The moment his eyes fell on Elaine, lying on the hospital bed, her face pale and strained with pain, his heart nearly stopped. "Elaine," he whispered, stepping forward. Her eyes were glazed with exhaustion, but there was a flicker of recognition in them when she saw him. "Jonathan," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "You came, I'm here," he said, choking on the words. He felt something shift within him, something deep and profound. The weight of his previous decisions, the missed dinners, the ignored calls, the days spent in the office while his family waited, hit him all at once. He had never understood the significance of these small moments until now. His entire life had been about building something grand, but in doing so, he had neglected the very thing that gave his life meaning: love, connection, family. As Jonathan took Elaine's hand, he looked down at her swollen belly, realizing that this was the moment that would define the rest of his life. But even as he stood there, helpless and full of regret, he knew there was no turning back. His son or daughter was about to be born, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The business deals, the fame, the fortune, they could all wait. He had made a choice, and as the nurses rushed around them, preparing for the delivery, Jonathan felt something shift inside him. This was the beginning of something new. His life would never be the same. But he wasn't prepared for what would come next. The room seemed to close in around Jonathan as he stood by Elaine's side, her grip tightening around his hand. The sterile hospital air was thick with tension, her shallow breaths punctuated by quiet groans of pain. The doctors and nurses were moving quickly now, their steps swift, purposeful, but there was an underlying urgency to their actions that made Jonathan's stomach churn. He had hoped for a peaceful moment, one where he could be there for her, be the supportive partner she needed. But as the monitors beeped and the medical staff rushed in and out, Jonathan realized that this moment wasn't going to be anything like he had imagined. "Elaine," Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaotic hum of the hospital. He squeezed her hand, watching as she winced in pain. "I'm here. I'm right here." Her lips parted as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion. "Jonathan. I'm scared." The word struck him like a punch to the gut. Fear. The word echoed in his mind. This wasn't just a birth, this was something more, a life-altering event, and they were both navigating it blindly. Jonathan had always prided himself on being in control. His entire career had been built on calculated risks, quick decisions, and the ability to manage chaos. But right now, he felt helpless. He didn't know what to do, how to fix it, how to make it better. He had no answers. The doctor, a calm but firm presence, approached the bed, his face set in a grim expression. "Mr. Myers, we're seeing some complications with the delivery. The baby's heartbeat is irregular, and Elaine is showing signs of distress. We need to move quickly." Jonathan felt his heart drop. What does that mean? What's happening? Is she okay? Is the baby okay? His voice cracked, the fear he had been holding back for hours suddenly bubbling to the surface. His entire life had led to this moment, and he wasn't ready. "Right now, it's difficult to say," the doctor replied, glancing at the monitor with a furrowed brow. "We're doing everything we can to stabilize both mother and child. But we're facing a delicate situation. If things don't improve soon, we may have to consider an emergency C-section." Jonathan's mind reeled. He had always heard stories about difficult births, about the risks, but hearing it for the first time, with Elaine right there beside him, hit him harder than anything else ever could. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. All of his plans, all of his decisions. The work he had prioritized over family, it all felt so meaningless now. His gaze shifted from Elaine's pale face to the doctor's, their hands moving with purpose, as if they were running out of time. He wanted to scream, to tell them to do something, anything, but he couldn't form the words. Instead, he just stood there, watching helplessly as the people in the room worked frantically. A part of him felt like an outsider, like he didn't belong in this space, in this moment. All of his achievements, all of the accolades and the prestige he had built over the years seemed so insignificant now. In the face of life and death, what did any of it matter? The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Elaine's grip on his hand tightened, and Jonathan leaned down, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Her skin was clammy, her breath shallow, but she managed a weak smile when she saw him watching her. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere," Jonathan promised, though his heart was racing. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, of not being there for her when she needed him the most. The doctor stepped back, giving them a moment of privacy. Jonathan remained by Elaine's side, watching as she labored, her face etched with pain. He felt a deep sense of guilt gnawing at him. How many times had he promised her he would be there? How many times had he told her that once the deal was done, he would come home, that he would be present? And yet, here he was, finally making the choice to be there, but only after everything had already spiraled into chaos. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of the world he had left behind. He glanced at the screen, his heart sinking as he saw the name of his lead negotiator. The merger, the one deal that had consumed his every waking moment for months. It was happening tomorrow, and they were waiting on his final approval. He had worked tirelessly for this moment, made sacrifices that no one else understood, and now, it was slipping away. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message that read, "We need your final say, Jonathan. The board's waiting." Jonathan's stomach churned as he stared at the message, feeling a sudden wave of panic. What if the deal fell through? What if his absence meant the loss of everything he had worked for? His hand shook as he set the phone down on the table, the sound of the beeping machines and the distant chatter of the medical staff filling the silence around him. But as he looked back at Elaine, her face contorted in pain, he knew in his gut that no deal, no amount of money, could ever make up for the moment he was about to miss if he didn't make the right choice. Another contraction hit, and Elaine gasped, her nails digging into Jonathan's hand as the pain intensified. He bent down, brushing her cheek gently. "You're doing great," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. What was the point of telling her she was doing great when the world outside this room was falling apart? The doctor returned, and Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. Mr. Myers, the doctor said, his tone even more serious now, we need to act fast. The baby's heart rate is dropping. We can't wait any longer. Jonathan looked down at Elaine, his heart breaking. She was staring up at him, tears streaming down her face. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that mirrored his own. Do what you have to do, Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. Just make sure she's okay. Please. Elaine's hand slackened in his as the medical staff moved around her, preparing for the emergency procedure. The room was filled with a frantic energy now, a sense of urgency that made Jonathan feel as though time was slipping through his fingers. He watched in helpless silence as the doctors and nurses took charge, working quickly but with a practiced calm that reassured him, even if only a little. This was what they did every day, and Jonathan had to trust that they knew what they were doing. As the anesthesiologist administered the sedative to Elaine, Jonathan's thoughts were scattered. His mind raced through everything, his career, his company, the board meeting tomorrow. He had been so wrapped up in the pursuit of success that he had never realized how little time he had left to be present for the people who mattered most. And now, standing here, with Elaine on the operating table, he felt like a man on the edge of a cliff, unsure of which way to go. But one thing was certain, he couldn't go back. He couldn't undo the years of neglect, the missed moments, the promises left unfulfilled. All he could do now was make sure that, from this moment forward, he would be there, no matter what. The sound of a baby's cry echoed through the room, sharp and piercing. Jonathan's breath caught in his chest. A wave of emotion washed over him as he looked at the tiny figure in the nurse's arms. It was his child. Their child. And for the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt something deep inside him stir, something far more powerful than any deal, any success, any accomplishment he had ever known. Tears welled up in his eyes as he took the baby into his arms, cradling the small, fragile life with a tenderness that surprised even him. In this moment, he realized that his life had been leading him here, to this point of transformation. Nothing else mattered now. Not the deals, not the board meetings, not the empire he had built. All that mattered was this new beginning. And as he looked at his baby, he knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. As Jonathan cradled his newborn child in his arms, the weight of the moment began to settle around him. The soft, rhythmic sound of the baby's tiny breaths filled the room, a stark contrast to the sterile beeping of the machines and the frenetic pace of the hospital staff moving about. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear or worry, but from an overwhelming sense of awe. This was the first time in years that Jonathan had truly felt present, truly felt alive. For all of his success, for all of the accolades and praise he had received in the world of business, nothing had ever compared to this. Holding his child, seeing the small, delicate fingers curl around his hand, it was a feeling he could not describe, a feeling that surpassed anything he had ever known. Elaine, still groggy from the anesthesia, gazed up at him with a mixture of exhaustion and love. Her eyes were soft, her face pale, but there was a smile there, a smile that Jonathan had longed to see in their years of marriage. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she whispered, her voice weak but filled with curiosity. "It's a boy," Jonathan answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our son." Her smile widened, and for a moment, all the pain and hardship that had defined their relationship seemed to vanish. It was just the two of them now, in this tiny room, with their child. The world outside, the demands of his company, the critical merger that had kept him away from home for weeks, none of it mattered anymore. In the presence of this tiny life, none of it seemed significant. But as much as Jonathan wanted to bask in the moment, he knew deep down that it couldn't last forever. Reality was a harsh mistress, and it was already knocking at the door. As Elaine drifted off into a peaceful, post-delivery sleep, Jonathan stood there for a while, still holding his son, still marveling at the incredible weight of fatherhood. He could feel the eyes of the world on him. The world that had watched him climb to the top, that had judged him for his workaholic tendencies, for his neglect of his family. His mind flickered back to the phone call that had shattered his carefully constructed routine. The merger, the deal that was meant to define his legacy, was slipping away without him. He had let it go. And now, he had to face the consequences. He looked down at his son's tiny face, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. He had made the decision to be here, to stay by Elaine's side, but the guilt was already creeping in. He had abandoned his empire, abandoned the world that had defined him for so long. Was it the right decision? Would this child, this family, even need him now that he was no longer the powerful CEO? Would they resent him for giving up the life he had built? The question gnawed at him, but he couldn't answer it yet. For now, all he could do was hold his son and promise, silently, that he would never let him down like he had let down Elaine. He had been a workaholic, obsessed with success, obsessed with power. But in this moment, he realized just how empty that obsession had been. There was a life to live here, a family to cherish, and he was only just beginning to understand it. Later that night, as the hospital room grew quiet, Jonathan slipped out into the hallway to make a call. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and he hesitated before answering. He had been avoiding this moment, putting it off as long as possible, but now there was no escaping it. "Mr. Myers," a voice said on the other end of the line. It was Alex, his lead negotiator. Jonathan could hear the urgency in his tone. "The board is waiting on you for the final approval. The deal is hanging by a thread. We can't proceed without your signature. We need you now, Jonathan." Jonathan's grip tightened around the phone as his thoughts swirled. His company, his life's work, was on the line. He had spent the past few months shaping the future of Myers Enterprises. But now, standing in the hallway of a hospital, his newborn son in his mind, the deal seemed insignificant. "I'm sorry, Alex," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I'm not going to make it. I can't. The merger will have to go on without me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jonathan could almost hear Alex processing the words, trying to understand what was happening. "Mr. Myers, this is a billion-dollar deal. We've been working toward this for months." "Your absence, I know," Jonathan interrupted, his voice firm. "But this is more important. I've made my choice." With that, he ended the call, his heart racing. The decision was final. There was no going back now. The company would have to figure things out without him. They would have to manage. He had made a promise to himself, a promise that his son would never experience the same neglect and emotional distance he had felt growing up. He would be there. No matter what it cost him. Jonathan returned to Elaine's side, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. The next few hours passed in a blur. The doctors checked Elaine's condition, and she rested, her body recovering from the ordeal. But as Jonathan sat by her side, the weight of the decision he had made began to sink in. His career was no longer the focal point of his life. His legacy was no longer tied to the success of Myers Enterprises, to the financial empire he had built. His legacy would be in the moments like this, being present, being a father, and being a husband. The following day, the media caught wind of Jonathan's decision. News outlets began circulating. Stories about the powerful CEO who had walked away from a billion-dollar deal to stay with his wife and child. The headlines varied: Myers CEO puts family before business, billionaire CEO makes the ultimate sacrifice, workaholic CEO finds redemption in fatherhood. The reactions were mixed, as expected. Some praised Jonathan for his decision, seeing it as a sign of personal growth. Others criticized him for abandoning his company at such a critical moment, questioning his priorities. But Jonathan didn't care. For the first time in years, he didn't care what anyone thought. He had made the choice to be there for his family, and that was all that mattered. Days turned into weeks, and as Jonathan settled into his new role as a father, he began to notice the subtle changes that had taken place within him. He no longer felt the pressure to be constantly on the go, constantly working to prove himself. Instead, he spent his time learning how to be a better husband, how to be a better father, how to be a better man. But the real transformation began when he stepped away from his role as CEO. As Myers Enterprises adjusted to the changes, Jonathan realized that his decision had ripples far beyond his family. The company began to shift its culture as well. The employees, who had once been driven by the same relentless work ethic that had consumed Jonathan, began to see things differently. There was a new focus on work-life balance, on the importance of family, on the need to slow down and appreciate the moments that mattered. Jonathan had learned the hard way that success, no matter how big, could never fill the void left by family and connection. His decision to walk away from the deal had been one of the hardest things he had ever done, but in the end, it was the best thing he could have done, for himself, for Elaine, and for their son. And as he watched his child grow, as he held his son in his arms each night, Jonathan realized that this was the true measure of success. The work would always be there. But moments like this, moments of love, connection, and family, were fleeting. And they were worth everything. The days following Jonathan's decision to step back from his company felt like a blur, a whirlwind of emotions, sleepless nights, and adjustments. But it was also a time of growth, both for him and for his family. The decision he had made to be there for Elaine and their newborn son had irrevocably changed his life. He had walked away from the empire he had built, the empire that had consumed every waking moment of his life for over a decade, and now he was left to face the consequences, both immediate and long-term. At first, the impact of his decision felt almost like a relief. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't waking up at the crack of dawn to check emails or rushing out the door to a meeting. He wasn't surrounded by the constant buzz of his phone or the pressure of financial reports and boardroom arguments. For the first time in ages, he was at home, with Elaine and their son, truly present, witnessing every moment of their new life together. He helped Elaine with the baby during the late-night feedings, the sleepless nights that he had never before experienced in his years of business. He marveled at the way his son's tiny hands grasped his fingers, at the way his son's eyes seemed to recognize him already, even at such a young age. But while the personal rewards were immediate, the consequences of his decision were beginning to catch up with him, and they weren't as easy to navigate. The calls kept coming. The emails flooded his inbox. His assistant, Sarah, left him endless voicemails, desperate for his response on various projects that were now in limbo. Myers Enterprises was floundering without his direction. His absence had left a power vacuum, and his trusted team was scrambling to keep the company running without him. The board, once supportive of his vision, was now questioning whether he was the right man to lead the company forward. News outlets reported on the CEO's sudden retreat from the public eye, speculating about his future and the future of the company. Some were even beginning to talk about his replacement, as though the decision had already been made. Jonathan sat in his living room one afternoon, his son cradled in his arms, gazing out the window at the city skyline. The view from their apartment was breathtaking, the lights of the city twinkling like stars. But in that moment, the beauty of it all seemed distant, as if he were staring at a world that no longer belonged to him. The weight of his decision was slowly sinking in. As much as he had convinced himself that walking away from his role as CEO was the right choice, he couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that had begun to creep into his thoughts. Was he making a mistake? Was it too late to go back? Would he ever be able to find fulfillment in anything other than his work? The phone rang again, breaking him out of his thoughts. Jonathan glanced at the screen and saw that it was Sarah. He sighed, knowing that there was no escaping it. "Jonathan," Sarah's voice was strained, as though she had been holding her breath, "I've been trying to reach you all morning. The board is calling an emergency meeting in an hour. They want to know when you're coming back." Jonathan felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. The board meeting. It was the culmination of weeks of internal debates and external pressure. They wanted answers, and he wasn't sure he could provide them. He had stepped away from the company because he felt he needed to, but now he was confronted with the harsh reality that the company was still his responsibility, whether he liked it or not. "I'm not coming back, Sarah," Jonathan said, his voice steady but his heart racing. "Not yet." "I understand, but the board doesn't," she replied, her tone a mix of frustration and concern. "They're questioning everything. Your leadership, your commitment, the future of the company. They don't know if they can continue without you. And if you don't show up, I don't know what's going to happen." Jonathan pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was too much, too fast. He had stepped away to focus on what mattered most, his family, but now, as the pieces of his life began to crumble, he wondered if he had made a huge mistake. Could he have balanced both? Could he have been there for his family and still managed his company without sacrificing either? The doubts gnawed at him as he sat in the silence of the living room, listening to the soft sounds of his son breathing against his chest. But as much as he wanted to ignore the phone call, to pretend that the world outside of his home didn't exist, he knew he couldn't. The world had moved on without him, and now he had to face the consequences of his decision. "Send my apologies to the board," Jonathan said after a long pause. "Tell them I'll be in touch, but I'm not coming back right now. They'll have to figure it out without me." As he ended the call, a heavy sense of guilt washed over him. He had worked so hard to build Myers Enterprises, pouring everything he had into it. And now, he was abandoning it when it needed him most. The weight of his decision was becoming unbearable. His company was suffering, and it felt as though the trust he had spent years building with his colleagues and clients was slipping away. For the next few days, Jonathan tried to immerse himself in his new role as a father. He helped Elaine with the baby, changed diapers, and spent time holding his son, hoping that somehow this new reality would make up for the uncertainty that clouded his mind. But it was impossible to ignore the growing sense of loss. He felt disconnected from everything he had once known. The business world, once so familiar to him, now seemed foreign. He had spent so many years climbing the ladder of success that now, at the top, he found himself with no clear direction. He had sacrificed his personal life for the promise of something greater, but now that he had it, he wondered if it had been worth it. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone, the doorbell rang. Jonathan stood up and walked to the door, opening it to find a familiar face standing on the other side. It was Alex, his former lead negotiator. "I was in the neighborhood," Alex said with a smile, though Jonathan could tell from his expression that there was more to the visit than casual conversation. "Can I come in?" "Of course," Jonathan replied, stepping aside to let him in. He had known Alex for years. He was one of the few people Jonathan still trusted in the business world. But there was a tension in the air that Jonathan couldn't ignore. Alex had always been the one to help keep things moving, to smooth over conflicts and keep the wheels of the company turning. But now, as he stepped into Jonathan's home, it felt as though that world was slipping farther and farther away. Alex sat down at the kitchen table, his gaze shifting between Jonathan and the baby in his arms. "You're making a big mistake, Jonathan." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the bluntness of Alex's words. "What do you mean?" "You're letting your family pull you away from everything you've worked for," Alex said, leaning forward. "I get it, the whole family first thing. But you're putting your company in jeopardy. You've spent years building it, and now you're just going to walk away." Jonathan felt his heart race. "I'm not walking away," he said, his voice strained. "I'm just trying to figure things out. I need time, Alex. I need to be with my family." Alex shook his head, his expression turning serious. "But the company needs you too. They need you to lead, to steer them through this crisis. You can't just abandon them now. You can't have it both ways, Jonathan." You can't have your family and your company. You have to choose. Jonathan's chest tightened at Alex's words. He had been trying to convince himself that he could balance it all, that he could be both the devoted father and the successful CEO. But as Alex's words lingered in the air, Jonathan realized that the reality was far more complicated. His absence from the company had already created cracks, and the longer he stayed away, the harder it would be to rebuild what he had spent so many years creating. But in that moment, as his son gurgled softly in his arms, Jonathan understood something fundamental. The decision he had made was irrevocable. He couldn't go back. There was no way to undo the choices he had made. But that didn't mean he couldn't move forward, that he couldn't learn to live in a world where success didn't have to come at the cost of his family. The days stretched into weeks, and Jonathan found himself slowly coming to terms with the reality of his new life. The pressure of his former life, his relentless drive for success, his obsession with growth and wealth, seemed so distant now. Yet, as he sat in the quiet of his home, holding his son in his arms, the weight of his decision lingered, not as a heavy burden, but as a challenge that he wasn't sure how to overcome. For the first time, Jonathan had no clear path ahead of him. He had always been certain of his career, his business, but now, his purpose seemed muddled, uncertain. He didn't know if he could ever go back to the person he was before, nor if he wanted to. But he couldn't deny the growing ache in his chest, the fear that his decision had come at too high a cost. One morning, as Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and watching his son slowly drift back to sleep in his bassinet, he received an unexpected call. It was from his former mentor, Gregory Hale, a man who had shaped much of Jonathan's business career. Gregory had been a father figure to him, always offering advice on how to manage a company, how to take calculated risks, and how to put your personal life second for the sake of success. He had taught Jonathan everything he knew about climbing the corporate ladder. But now, the mentor was calling at a time when Jonathan's life was no longer centered around the boardroom. There was no mention of business, no talk about mergers or acquisitions, just a simple, cryptic message: "Jonathan, I think it's time we had a real conversation." At first, Jonathan hesitated. What could Gregory want now? What advice could he possibly offer him in this new chapter of his life? But something told him that this conversation might be different from the ones they had had in the past. Maybe Gregory had the wisdom Jonathan needed now, wisdom not about business, but about life. "Jonathan," Gregory's voice came through the phone, warm but firm. "I've been watching what's happening, and I know you've made some big decisions. And I want to tell you something. This is the hardest part, the part where you have to learn to live with what you've done. You have to be at peace with it. I've seen a lot of men like you, men who spent so much of their life building something, only to realize that what they've built comes at a cost. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Gregory to be so blunt. "I'm trying to figure that out," Jonathan admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I've walked away from the company, from everything I've worked for. And I'm starting to feel like I've made a mistake. My absence is causing chaos at Myers Enterprises. The board's losing patience. The company might not survive without me." Gregory's voice was steady. "Don't be so quick to measure your worth by the company. I know you've always been a driven man, Jonathan, but you've got to learn to redefine your success. The real question is, what do you want your legacy to be? Do you want it to be the empire you built, or do you want it to be your family, the people who will be there long after the company is gone?" Jonathan swallowed hard. Gregory's words stung because they hit too close to home. For so long, he had believed that his legacy would be tied to the success of Myers Enterprises, to the empire he had painstakingly crafted. But now, standing in the kitchen with his son in his arms, he wasn't sure if that was the legacy he wanted anymore. Could he walk away from the company completely, or would he always feel the pull to return to it? Could he be the father he wanted to be and still keep the business running? "Gregory, "I don't know what to do," Jonathan confessed, feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't in years. "I feel like I'm letting everyone down. The company, the employees who depend on me, the clients who trust me. I can't just walk away from all of that. But at the same time, I can't ignore the way I feel about my family now. I want to be there for them. I want to be a father, not just a CEO." Gregory's response was calm, even empathetic. "Jonathan, you're not letting anyone down. You're letting yourself grow. I'm not going to lie to you, it's going to be difficult. The road ahead will be filled with doubt and frustration. But in the end, you will find peace when you stop measuring your worth by the things you've built and start measuring it by the people you've loved and the moments you've shared. Your legacy will be the love you give, the lessons you teach your son, and the family you raise." For the first time in weeks, Jonathan felt something stir inside him, a sense of clarity, even if it was faint. Gregory's words resonated deeply within him. He had spent so many years thinking that success was about achieving the next milestone, reaching the next goal, expanding the company, but perhaps success was something different altogether. Perhaps it was about finding balance, about choosing the right things to fight for. After the conversation with Gregory, Jonathan spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet reflection. The doubts that had clouded his mind were still there, but now they were joined by something else, an understanding. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't going to solve everything in one day. But he was starting to realize that there were no perfect answers, no clear-cut solutions. He had to move forward with what he had, with the family he now had, and find a way to build a future that didn't revolve around business deals and boardroom victories. That evening, as he sat on the couch with Elaine, watching their son drift off to sleep in his crib, Jonathan finally found a sense of peace. His phone buzzed again, another message from Sarah, asking for a response on the next steps for the company. He glanced at it, but didn't immediately respond. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to. He had spent too many years chasing success at the cost of everything else, and now he was ready to shift his focus. "Elaine," Jonathan said softly, his voice laced with conviction. "I've been thinking a lot. I think it's time to make some changes. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I know one thing, I'm going to be here for you and our son. We're going to build something different. Together." Elaine turned to him, her eyes tired but filled with love. She smiled, a warmth in her gaze that Jonathan hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming." In that moment, Jonathan realized that he didn't need the approval of the board, the accolades of the business world, or the validation of his success. He had found something far more important, something that would sustain him for the rest of his life. It wasn't about being the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, it was about being the father, the husband, the man who had learned to put his family first. And as he looked at Elaine and their son, he knew he had made the right choice. There was no going back, but he was finally content with that. He had embraced his new legacy, and he was ready to face whatever came next. Months had passed since Jonathan had made the decision to walk away from his empire. The sharp contrasts in his life, once dominated by the relentless grind of business, now softened by the tender moments of family life, were slowly beginning to feel more natural. Yet, as his son grew, as his family settled into a rhythm, the world outside had continued to move forward, indifferent to the changes in Jonathan's life. The news had stopped covering his sudden disappearance from the CEO chair. The whispers from the board, from colleagues, and from the media had quieted down, but Jonathan knew that what had been left unsaid lingered in the background. He had made a choice to prioritize his family, but in doing so, he knew he had left behind a legacy that could never fully be replaced. Or could it? His mornings were now filled with routines that had once been foreign to him, playing with his son, taking long walks in the park with Elaine, spending time in the kitchen preparing dinner. It was the kind of life Jonathan had only imagined in fleeting moments, never fully grasping its value until now. He had thought he would feel lost without the rush of corporate meetings, the whirlwind of deals, and the constant pressure of being at the top of the ladder. But the peace of these quieter days, these smaller moments of connection, filled him with a sense of purpose that no boardroom ever had. Still, there were days when the doubts crept in. He had moments when he questioned whether he had made the right choice. Was stepping away from his business truly what was best for his family, or had he simply run away from the pressure? The quiet mornings with Elaine and their son were fulfilling, but there was a part of Jonathan that still longed to feel like he was contributing to something larger than himself. The truth was, he couldn't entirely sever himself from the business world. He had built it, he had bled for it, and in some ways, it would always be a part of him. One evening, as Jonathan sat on the couch, his son asleep in his arms, Elaine came to sit beside him. She rested her head on his shoulder, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The soft hum of the city outside their apartment filled the silence. But there was something in the stillness of that moment that felt heavy, like something important was hanging in the air, waiting to be said. Finally, Elaine spoke, her voice quiet but filled with an understanding that only someone who had shared so many years with him could possess. "I can see it, Jonathan," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of his hand. "I can see that you're not completely happy. You're here with us, and that's what matters. But I know you. There's a part of you that feels like you've lost something, like you don't know where you fit anymore." Jonathan sighed, his chest tight. He had been afraid of this conversation, not because he didn't want to hear it, but because he feared that she was right. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Elaine. I don't know if walking away from everything was the right choice. I love being here with you and the baby, but I feel like I'm drifting." Elaine turned to face him, her eyes locking with his, as though she could see into the very depths of his soul. "Jonathan, it's okay to feel like this. I know you've spent your whole life building something. And now you've built something else, this family. But you don't have to lose yourself in the process. You don't have to choose between the two. You just need to figure out what matters most to you." Jonathan leaned back, his mind whirling. He had spent so many years chasing success that he had never really stopped to think about what it would look like if he ever caught it. Now, in the quiet of his home, with Elaine by his side and his son asleep in the other room, Jonathan realized that success, at least the kind he had been pursuing, didn't hold the same meaning it once had. He had achieved everything he had set out to do, but now, the question wasn't about climbing higher, it was about finding fulfillment in the present, in the people who mattered most to him. The next day, Jonathan made a decision. It wasn't a decision to go back to the way things were, to return to the business world that had once consumed him. Instead, it was a decision to find a new way to contribute, to use his knowledge and skills in a way that aligned with his values now. He didn't have to be the CEO of a billion-dollar company to make a difference. His time at home, raising his son, was just as valuable as any deal he had ever brokered. And in the days that followed, Jonathan began to see his old world with new eyes. He reached out to a few of his former colleagues, people he respected, and quietly began offering his expertise to smaller, up-and-coming businesses. Businesses that needed guidance but didn't have the resources to hire high-powered executives. He wasn't interested in making money from these ventures, he was interested in making a difference. His years of experience had given him insights into business strategy, leadership, and growth. And now, he wanted to use that knowledge to help others without the pressure of corporate greed. Jonathan found joy in mentoring these entrepreneurs, helping them build sustainable businesses that prioritized people over profit. It was a humble shift, but it was a shift that felt right. As time went on, Jonathan's perspective on success began to evolve. He no longer measured it by the size of his paycheck or the number of deals he closed. Success, for Jonathan, was about impact, not just in the business world, but in the lives of those around him. And as he sat at his desk one evening, drafting a proposal for a new startup, he realized that the work he was doing now had a depth to it that his previous endeavors had lacked. He had the ability to shape lives, to influence the direction of a company, but more importantly, he had the ability to shape his own life. Through his work with these small businesses, Jonathan started to see the ripple effect of his decisions. His work was no longer confined to boardrooms and conference calls. Instead, he found himself connecting with people, sharing ideas, and helping them grow in ways that felt meaningful. The world outside his home was still there, still waiting for him, but now it was a world he could engage with on his own terms. He wasn't chasing after the next big deal or the next financial milestone. He was focusing on what truly mattered, people. And with each passing day, Jonathan grew more confident in his new path. He realized that being a good father, a good husband, and a good man didn't require him to sacrifice everything he had once believed in. He could still contribute to the world, but in a way that honored the values he had discovered during his time away from the corporate world. He no longer needed to prove himself to anyone. His legacy wasn't in the size of his company or the wealth he amassed. His legacy was in the relationships he built, the impact he made on others, and the love he gave to his family. As Jonathan watched his son take his first steps, feeling the warmth of his wife's hand in his, he knew he had made the right decision. He had given up one world for another, but in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable. The world would always need people like him, people who were driven, ambitious, and capable of great things. But the world, he now realized, also needed people who were willing to slow down, to listen, and to make a difference in the lives of those around them. Jonathan's story wasn't one of complete surrender to a new life, nor was it a tale of redemption in the traditional sense. It was a story of balance, of understanding that success didn't have to come at the expense of the things that truly mattered. His legacy would be a blend of both worlds, the one he had built and the one he had come to cherish. And as he looked at his son, now running through the yard, his laughter echoing in the air, Jonathan knew that the true measure of his life was in the love he gave and the impact he left behind. The business world would keep turning, but for Jonathan, this was the start of something far more profound.